let everyone know
this meeting is being recorded.
It is being recorded. So hello, everyone. I'm Jervis, or Jay Johnson, and I'm one of the leaders here of this meetup, which we started. It's a community now. It's a global community. We started several years ago, and it's about enterprise Agile. So we try to focus on, what are we going to do to make companies and people and all that be Agile in large companies and corporations, because, large companies and corporations or organizations have a lot of constraints and things we have to work through to make change, right? Compared to a small company or medium company, not that they don't have to go through significant challenges and issues as well. It just seems like the larger the organization is, the mathematics of people, the more difficult it is. So that's kind of what we focus on. So today we have a wonderful person that's going to tell us about all these different Agile ways and so forth. A few years ago, there's a few people that did some studies on this and said there's 40 something ways out there. I'm pretty sure it's probably over 50 now, Greg, but you'll talk about it. And there's a lot of different ways. And every time I turn around, someone's inventing a new way of doing this, which is it's cool because, we want to be continuous learners and we want to apply new techniques and new ways of thinking and new ways of working inside of our organization. So that's what our group's about. So now I'm going to turn it over to Gopal. Gopal is one of our leaders, and he's going to introduce our wonderful speaker tonight, Craig Smith. Gopal.
Thank you, Jay. Welcome, everybody. Just want to say a couple of words about Craig. First of all, thank you, Craig, for spending time with us today. This is a very interesting topic. We have all had some level of experience with Agile, but coming up with a list of everything that, all the different techniques and all the different frameworks of Agile, and you doing it in 40 minutes, it's amazing. We are definitely looking forward to this. Just to give you guys a little bit of background about Craig, he has been doing Agile for a long, long time. I wouldn't say how long, he can do that himself. He has been doing a podcast for more than 10 years about Agile. He was an editor of Agile at InfoQ, and then he was also with the Agile Alliance for a number of years as well. He's still an Agile Alliance member. But he, the big thing is he's actually embodies what is called a global citizen. He works all sorts of hours and with all sorts of clients around the world and presents to all sorts of groups of people around the world as well. Today, he's based out of Brisbane, Australia, but you can see him, talking to people from around the world and working with people around the world. He works for a company called SoftEd that has a global presence. So, he has to work those hours as well. But, his experience, his knowledge, and the way in which he brings forward the points with respect to, his the different frameworks. I've heard him speak. It's amazing. So you guys are in a treat today. So without much further ado, Craig, take it away.
Thanks, Gopal. Thanks, everybody. I'll just put this while I'm getting the screen up here. Actually, can you guys allow me to share screen? I've got that disabled for some reason.
Jay? Jay, you have to make Craig a co-host.
So while they're doing that, firstly, the talk is called 40 Agile Methods in 40 Minutes. We have a little longer in the session. I can do this talk in 40 minutes. I did it last week in front of a live audience in 37 minutes, which is a record for me in doing this. That's to get in to the timeframes. there's actually more than 40 methods in here. In fact, Gopal was trying to convince me to call this 60 Agile methods in 60 minutes, but in order to change all the titles and things. So, we're not going to keep ourselves strictly to the 40-minute time frame, just so we can get through the topics. And if you have any questions along the way, I'm happy to either stop and take them along the way, or we can do them at the end. But this will still be a fairly quick run through. There's lots of things to share with you here. These slides will be made available, so don't worry too much about trying to capture every screen. Some of them might just pop on and pop off the screen. There's lots of detail inside each of these slides, and that's on purpose so that you can go and actually research these things yourself after the fact. So don't feel too bad if you don't capture all of the details. As I said, we'll make the slides available so you can continue on and take a closer look at anything you want to see later on. So hopefully you're all seeing the slides now. I think the first question is probably why talk about this, this talk actually came about at a Scrum gathering. I submitted this for a Scrum gathering probably. It was probably about 7 or 8 years ago now here in Australia. And really it was because I wanted to tell the Scrum community there were 39 other things that they should probably be aware of. Nothing wrong with Scrum per se. It's just that sometimes you start to run out a bit of runway. And so that was really the history behind it. The other thing is that beautiful thing about our Agile community is that there is no one way. Nobody owns it. Nobody has control over it. We can all find our own way. And because there is not just, one thing, we can learn from so many other things. So it's not about necessarily using all 39 of these methods, but knowing they're existing and knowing that there's a place to go if you want to do something different. Now, the original version of this talk, as I said, was back in 2015, and some of you may have seen this diagram. Particularly Steve Denning seems to use it quite a lot. Actually, this was an infographic by the fantastic Lynn Kazali down here in Australia, who was trying to just keep up with the as fast as we were going. So things like the quadrants don't mean anything. She was just trying to get everything onto her little iPad as she was doing this. The one thing that's always ironic about this is that people who know me would say, "Hey, this 40 Agile methods thing is Craig, but why are people telling you to open your eyes to other methods?" No, that was the message, not Craig Smith. Open your eyes. That's my name, and the message is open your eyes. But people who knew me would always come and ask me, why that was written on there. So I'm pleased to say, and this we only just launched this last week, is that we now have a new infographic which has all the new methods on there. We got rid of the quadrants and a few things like that, but this is the myriad of things we're going to talk about in this talk. All right. So is everybody ready? Everybody belted in? Everyone got a beverage? Beer o'clock where most of you are, I suspect. So settle in. Let's go and take a run through 40 Agile methods. So let's start and let's just talk about the foundations, which I'm sure you're all fairly much aware of. Right? This one doesn't even get a number because it's the granddaddy of them all. It's the Agile Manifesto, or by its proper name, the Manifesto for Agile Software Development, written in 2001. 17 methodologists got together in order to essentially agree, at least on a common ground, and they came up with the word Agile. Right? Originally, it was called lightweight methods, which is probably good for us because otherwise we'd be at the Enterprise Lightweight Meetup, and I'm not sure any of us probably would want to turn up to that. So I'm glad they came up with the word Agile. And we all know and love this: the 4 values, the 12 principles, 2001. So the thing about this, and what's interesting as you start to look through all of the methods that we have here, and even the ones that aren't, is that in some way, shape, or form, they all do come back to this, right? They all build off that, and that's what allows us to call them Agile methods. So this is still our baseline. Well, let's start with Scrum, number 1. Not that Scrum, but this Scrum. I'm sure you all know the process. We all talk about the teams. The Scrum guide keeps getting updated. Was last updated in, I think it was 2020. It is the basis for iterative methods that's out there, and lots of other methods use a version of this or just use it directly. If you look at any of the surveys, the last Digital AI survey, which came out last year, still had it as the most popular method with 66%. That's dropped a little bit, but it's still the one that most teams tend to suggest they're using. There's so much information out there about it. If anyone's talking about Agile, quite often they'll be seen to be talking about Scrum. There are some downsides though. Certification, where do you go? Do you go to scrum.org? Do you go to Scrum Alliance? Do you go to any of the other type vendors for this? One of the downsides doesn't talk anything about anything other than the process, and it is small team focused. It was never meant to scale. It was only ever at the team level, and you do have to get across some of the different sources. But again, with Scrum, a bit like the manifesto, everything does come back to that Scrum guide. One of the problems, though, is people say they do Scrum. What they're actually doing is what we call Scrum but. And not that kind of but this kind of but. It's when you say something like, I do Scrum, but as you can see, that we're doing Scrum, but our sprints are 12 weeks long. I don't know about you, but in my consulting gig, I get all sorts of weird, wonderful reasons why people can't do what it is. That's Scrum but. We need to move people from Scrum but to Scrum and. And that's, again, what this talk is all about. In fact, Ken Schwaber, right, one of the authors of the Scrum Guide, says that we need to move to Scrum and, because once we run out of runway in Scrum, we need to actually think about what's next. So you can still follow the rules of Scrum, but add the extras on the end of it. And that's what Scrum and is all about. So Scrum and is an interesting concept. Around about the same time as Scrum, XP came out, not that XP. That actually did come out ironically in the same year as Extreme Programming, but talking about this XP. Kent Beck in 1996. Great set of books, particularly the White Book, which was my first Agile book back when I started. And Gopal said at the start that I'd been around for a long time, doing this. This was my first book, and it was the only book I had. There was only really 2 books out in the market. There was this and a Scrum book, and I picked this one up. I dog-eared it from end to end, and still to this day, still holds up in a lot of cases. In fact, there was a whole set of books and a wiki based around this. The interesting thing is, if you never looked at Extreme Programming, if you look at the diagram in the top left, you'll see that it looks very much like Scrum, right? They still have planning, right? They have iterations instead of sprints. They still have that release or that potentially shippable increment at the end. But they've put around some of the technical aspects, right? Things like we need to have architecture, things that we need to do experimentation that they called spikes, that we had to test. It had a lot more of the technical practices in it. In fact, I love the diagram on the right-hand side, the practices, right? And they all revolve around each other. If you try and pull one out, it's a bit like playing pick up sticks. You pull a little stick out and the whole thing falls over, or a bit like Jenga. So all of these things rely on each other as you move through. The interesting thing about Extreme Programming, I got to speak to Kent Beck a few years ago, and his belief is that they just lost the marketing war, right, to Scrum. Scrum just did a better job of that, right? There was no certifications, there was nothing around this, and as a result, it kind of withered on the vine a little bit. I actually sort of disagreed with him a little bit, because actually I said, look, a lot of these practices just become good software engineering practice. And it doesn't mean that they actually have all taken hold, right? That's part of our job, is to make sure that we continue to fight for good software engineering practice. But a lot of these things just became the way that we should do things. Like Scrum, it still was small team focused and did require a lot of discipline. But interesting, it had its own principles and values in there as well, and well worth a look, and it still holds true. A lot of the other manifesto authors had things going on, and again, I probably would have had to have 300 Agile methods, 300 minutes to go through them. But here are some of the other methods that were those foundational ones that actually made a bit of a difference. And one was Crystal. This was the work of Alistair Coburn back in the 90s. Wrote a book called Crystal Clear. In fact, this was a whole set of methods of different colors, clear, yellow, orange, red, magenta, and blue, as you can see up the top there. And the idea of this was 3 dimensions, is that firstly, you pick the method based on team size. Once you understood the team size, you then looked at the criticality of the project and then the priority, and that determined which color that you would go with. Unfortunately, he never wrote anything, at least published anything other than the Crystal Clear book. He did talk about some of the other colors in the work, but there was a lot of things that we now just take for granted as being part of agility that were part of Crystal. If you talk about things like cross-functional teams, that came from Crystal. If you talk about the words frequent delivery, having a focus, all of those things, putting things on walls, were all part of Crystal. And it also had this whole cycle process that we all sort of know and love. What sprints upon sprints mean, and they sort of roll up into deliveries and projects and things like that. It talked a lot about personal safety and focus as well. And the other really interesting thing about Crystal was that it was looking at I guess what a product was all about, whether it was just a product or whether it was life changing or life essential. So very interesting stuff in there. The hard thing about this was it's hard to change from different colors. Hadn't really thought about this. It was very focused on co-located teams, which again, if you've heard Agile's about co-located teams, comes from Crystal, and was very lightweight in its, and so it required a lot of discipline to do. But again, lots of interesting things that came from Crystal. DSDM was another early adopter, very popular in Europe. In more recent years, has been renamed to Agile PM, which is kind of good because DSDM was, I guess, behind a bit of a paywall. It was very hard to get access to the materials. Since they've moved to Agile PM and the Agile Business Consortium have sort of taken control of this, that they have opened that up a lot more. But again, lots of things that we take for granted. If you've ever used Moscow for prioritization, must have, should have, could have, won't have yet, that's a concept that came from DSDM. It also had this whole process. It is linked to Prince too, so it's a little structured in places. Probably it was probably an easy sort of move from waterfall to this because it still had a lot of the gates and things in there because it was built around project management, and hence its name Agile PM still is. But they had these sort of principles here, right? Delivering on time, collaborating, building quality in, all of those things were built in here. It was also one of the ones that really put testing onto the map as well. So I said it evolved to Agile PM in 2016. It is relatively heavyweight if you really dig into into DSDM. If you want to see the original DSDM documents, you can read them online. Although, despite its heavyweightness, it's a bit vague in places as well. But nonetheless, right, a lot of the things that we just know when you see in Agile training come from DSDM. If you want to go back to really foundations, EVO is the foundry method. Evolutionary project management. This is the work of Tom Glib. It goes all the way back to the 1960s, and a lot of people feel that this is the beginning of agility. Again, lots of things in here that I guess we just take for granted. If you look at the principles on the right-hand side of the page there, do high risk first, right? Decompose the work, design for the simplest thing. Think about architecture early on that can be changed, right? Learn fast and change fast are all Agile principles that came decades before we really started talking about agility in general. The problem is that apart from the books and a few websites, all the stuff you can get from Tom Gilb, it's fairly limited resources, and all the newer methods have sort of built on top of this. But it'd be remiss not to mention it as part of a talk about different Agile methods. The other early adopter was RAD and ASD. We kind of put these together. RAD was actually where I first started my Agile journey without knowing it. So it was in the the mid-90s when I started doing RAD to develop client server type applications. Again, the whole idea was high quality and high speed. Sit with the customer, understand their needs, right? Build with them, side by side. It was a very hard thing to sell back in those days. Jim Highsmith sort of built on this idea from James Martin. Again, in the early 90s, he came up with adaptive software development, which is one of the first methods to actually have this sort of cycle that a lot of us use now. Right? We often talk about discovery, delivery, and operate. He talked about this idea of speculation, collaboration, learning, and then releasing. So this whole idea of cycles really comes from this. And he was really thinking about feature-based iterative type work. And really that relationship with users was the keystone behind both of these. Both of these are pretty uncommon or even close to dead now. They've been replaced by newer methods. The thing about RAD that was always something that people struggled with was this idea of good enough, whereas quality has been built a lot more into newer Agile principles, and sometimes, as I said, consider hack and test. But still, a lot of things we can learn, and taking a look at both these books, you'll sort of find a lot of the key things. As I said, there are a lot more foundations, but they're the ones we can build on. All right. So everyone's still with me. Let's shift gears and let's talk about lean, because lean is and we could argue. I don't know if there's any lean folks in the room. Agilists tend to say that, hey, lean is part of Agile, and the lean folks go, no, it's not, and all the rest of it. Look, we're very, very close related. So however you sort of put them together, lean methods have had a lot of bearing on what we do. So if we start with a granddaddy, right, all sorts of different names, right? Lean manufacturing, lean enterprise, Toyota production system, all those types of things. And again, these things are really important. In fact, we can date this all the way back to 1850 and Eli Whitney, when he was essentially trying to look at production. Taiko Ono really sort of made this a lot more prevalent in 1936 as part of the Toyota production system. It wasn't until 1990 when James Womack wrote the book The Machine That Changed the World that brought this to the everyday person. And then past that, we've had lots of books written about the Toyota production system, and it's really changed the way that manufacturing is done. And so, we often talk about the house of lean. That's where that comes from. Key lean principles at the top there. Again, these are just part of agility, right? We need to define value. We need to map it out. We need to understand the flow. Make sure we work on the most important thing in pursuit of perfection. So we can take those. Continuous improvement. So things like Carters and Muda, right? Removing waste is a thing. A lot of people talk about Agile being about speed. Well, it's as much about speed as it is about eliminating waste. Eliminate waste and you'll get speed. So the lean things are super important. The problem is when you read any of the lean stuff, it's about manufacturing. It doesn't often match to the type of work that we all do. So therefore, it can be a little hard to match back, which is why there's been sort of other movements in this world to help. One of them that's very interesting is the theory of constraints. You want to go back to the history of this, really, Eli Goldratt and his fantastic book, The Goal, back in 1984, was where this came to the fore. Now, if you haven't read The Goal before, I'm sure many of you may have read the Phoenix Project. The Phoenix Project is essentially an updated version of The Goal. The Goal was more manufacturing driven. Phoenix Project was more DevOps driven. Same type of thing. It's a story or a fable. The idea of theory of constraints is very simply identify the bottleneck, identify the constraint in your system, then restructure the rest of the organization around it. So the key is you've got to find those bottlenecks. And that's especially key when we're trying to move our organizations toward agility. There's a whole thinking process to this. And this has become the basis of so many different methods and applications. The interesting thing about the goal is that if you go read it, I think there's still parts of it we haven't actually fully uncovered and realized. There's still a lot of gold in this. And I don't think we've fully actually articulated it all. One of the problems still was that was all about manufacturing. So in the early 2000s, Mary and Tom Poppendieck came together and they took these concepts and then made them a little more IT or knowledge work relevant. So they had 3 books. It really started with this book, which is Lean Software Development. There was 3 books, and they essentially took Lean as it was and boiled it down to 7 principles and 22 different tools, and kind of use this deliver acronym to kind of do it. But what it does is it takes those techniques and applies them to software development and change the name a little bit, right? Things like building quality in and optimizing the whole and those type of words. Very high level, doesn't really tell you how to do it, but does make sense of it in a knowledge work type of way. In more recent years, in fact, just the last couple of years, the flow system. This is the work of Nigel Thurlow, John Turner, and Brian Riviera. They released this in 2019. It's called the flow system. This is about a more modern look at lean. So they've taken that same house of lean and updated it to 3 key areas. They call it the triple helix of flow, which is complexity thinking, distributed leadership, and team science. All these guys were ex-Toyota, so they know lean extremely well, but really wanted to update it for what we think is this more VUCA or volatile, uncertain, complex and adaptive world, and builds upon all the things that they have inside the Toyota production system. There is a guide you can get online. There is a book there as well. All of those are still reasonably introductory. I sat a full day class on this, and honestly, I still don't think we scratched the surface. I've noticed more recently they've got a whole comprehensive certification and assessment program around this, where I assume they do get into it a lot deeper. But it's an interesting way of looking at a more updated version of lean, particularly for the types of work that many of us do. If you do want to get back and see where a lot of these things come from, Deming is a great place to go. Deming, 1939, right? Look, if you haven't read this book, there's no real excuses. This book is so old, it's actually out of copyright, so it's in the public domain, so you can just go and get this book freely. And a bit like what I was saying before, this is something where I just don't think we've ever fully extrapolated everything that Deming's taught us. You can't go to an Agile conference these days without hearing somebody quoting Deming, right? He's just got sound bites and things all over the place. But he is essentially the grandfather of systems thinking. He had these 14 points. Now, if you look at these 14 points down the bottom, you'll see that this is agility in action, except this was 1939, right? The wording's a little dated, but it's still the same stuff, right? Things like, right, build quality in, as we were talking about before, drive out fear, essentially, we should be
requires organizational change, focus on internal process.
I'm sorry, is that person speaking to me? Not sure.
I don't think so, Craig. Jay, if you don't mind muting the people. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, drive out fear, right? You know, it's essentially psychological safety. It's an outdated concept. Of course, we've learned a lot more about diversity, equity, inclusion over the years, but it's the same type of idea. You know, eliminating quotas, right? Bring in leadership. Don't manage, right? Don't command and control. Lead. You know, have pride in your workmanship, right? We call that craftsmanship now, right? If you look at all of these 14 points, they're all just sort of less modern variants about what we're talking about now. You know, he was behind Plan, Do, Study, and Act. You might know Plan, Do, Check, Act, PDCA. He said that he wanted it to be Plan, Do, Study, Act because he wanted to emphasize inspection over analysis, right? So he wanted to make it more real. You know, it's essentially the same theory though. You know, the whole idea of systems thinking and looking for variations. If you really get to the heart of this, it does require organizational change, but everything does. It is very focused on internal processes, but nonetheless, we can learn a lot from Deming. The more modern variant of this is Don Reinerson and Product Development Flow, you know, popularized in his book, The Principles of Product Development Flow, which ironically has a waterfall on the cover. 175 principles in this book. You know, this is packed full of content. And if you've ever wanted the science or the mathematics to explain why this stuff works, this is where you'll find it. You see, he talks about the cardinal sins, but essentially this boils it down. You know, he talks about, you know, the importance of optimal batch size, of breaking things down, doing the, you know, the highest delay cost job first, right? So cost of delay, the importance of batch sizes and flow and decentralized work and all those types of things. Look, the book is so dense. It is not a book you can read cover to cover. I interviewed Don a few years ago and I said, Don, I love your book, but it's a little hard to read. And his answer to me was, Craig, my book is like fine cheese. You can only take it in small doses, which is exactly it. It's the book you pull off your shelf every now and again when you want to go, I need to prove why, you know, I need to cut the batch size. But, you know, taking a look through this again, I think this book is one of those ones that we probably haven't given the consideration that we need in the community as much. I think there's going to be lots of things here, and I think, you know, well past his lifetime, people are still going to be talking about Don Reinerson in the same way they were talking about Deming. So, you know, take a look at the work of Don if you haven't seen it already. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Kanban, right? Kanban, you know, based on lean principles. 2010, David J. Anderson popularized it. There are lots of authors doing something similar around this, but David, I guess, is considered the person who came up with it. Very simple 4 principles, right? Start with where you are now, right? Look to change incrementally, right? Respect the current process and make sure you consider leadership. The interesting of the first 3 principles there were chosen specifically to avoid emotional resistance to change. You know, you're not changing lots. You're just saying, let's just, you know, visualize what we're doing and move forward. And I think that's you know, that's a very interesting way of moving forward. Problem is, when most people think about Kanban, they just think about the wall, right? That's not Kanban. Right? Kanban is actually the whole process and all the things that come with it. And these 5 core properties: visualize your work, limit the work in progress, really measure and manage that flow, make your policies explicit about, you know, how something moves from one part to another. Sorry, my mouse is getting very sensitive today. And use models to recognize improvement opportunities. It's very simple, but requires a lot of discipline. Now, interesting, at the same time, personal Kanban, Jim Benson was actually kind of working around the same stuff at the time. You know, he took the same thing, except he was looking at it for personal work, right? So your own to-do list. Same thing, except just 2 rules: visualize your work and limit your work in progress. Right? It is Kanban for one, right? But based on the same principles. Lean Startup came also around about the same time. Interesting thing about Lean Startup, this is a book by Eric Ries in 2008. This was the first book that ever made the New York Times bestseller list in the area of project management or agility. You know, most people, you know, we sit around and care about it and come to meetups like this. Most people couldn't care less. This one actually made the New York Times bestseller list, and it was talking about things that we all care about. And it made the word agile go mainstream. And the interesting thing about Lean Startup is it just assumed back in 2008, of course, you're all doing Agile. Because if you want to go at this, you know, fast entrepreneurial pace, then of course you need Agile principles, and they're kind of built into the process, which you can see up the top here. Essentially this build, measure, learn loop. Build the smallest thing you can, measure it, learn from it, and then loop. Now, there has been, you know, some people that sort of have criticized this a little bit, you know, perhaps that it's not as product centered as it should be, and there's a bit of science lacking behind it. But what you absolutely, you know, can't deny is popularized a whole pile of terms, rightly or wrongly, into our community, right? MVP, which I believe is the most commonly misunderstood term on the planet. But if you want the definition, it came from here. Same things like continuous deployment, being able to pivot, right? And the fact that, really believing that, whether you're a large organization or a small organization, this can apply to you. So yeah, Lean Startup really made a change to our community. All right, well, there's some of the lean methods. Let's talk about some of the extending methods, right? So just in agility, things where we've just extended things just a little. And so we have a whole pile of things where they're just built on top of, I guess, the manifesto a little bit, or just the way of working. Joshua Kurieski in 2015 came out with Modern Agile, just boiling it down to 4 key steps, right? Making people awesome, deliver value continuously, making safety a prerequisite, experiment learning rapidly. The key thing I think in that one was safety. Talking about psychological safety is something that we probably haven't done a lot of. Alistair Coburn, also in 2015, brought the heart of Agile, right? Being one of the manifesto authors, he was just constantly frustrated that people were just making a mess of it and wanted to boil it down to 4 key things: collaborate, deliver, reflect, and improve. Sam Zawadi, who was originally out of London, out of Australia, has Agnostic Agile, and it's got 13 principles to what we consider Agnostic Agile to be, which is essentially not believing in any one particular method, but being open to all different frameworks and the principles there. And even sort of threw my own stuff on here, but we've been trying to boil down at SoftEd the value life cycle of work just to be very simple and go to give people some guidance about where you might start and how you might move, but most importantly, realizing that all these things are constantly spinning. It's not a step-by-step type approach, that discovery is always happening, delivery is always happening, and the business is always operating. And then, of course, we have all these hybrid methods, where people have just taken things and slammed them together. We have Scrum Ban, Zanpan, and Scrum XP, right? Which is people trying to make a buck on other people's stuff, I guess. But Scrum Ban was, we can put Scrum and Kanban together, which is Corey Latis. Alan Kelly has Zanpan about bringing XP plus Scrum and Lean. And even the SAFE folks talk about Scrum XP because they realized that the technical practices weren't existent in Scrum. Of course, the thing a lot of organizations fall into is the water Scrum fall. I'm not sure that's a good one to bring together. But the thing is, if you're just doing Agile in your development teams and you don't look left and right and look at the entire flow from end to end, you'll get yourself in a bit of a pickle. And Judah Eckstein and John Buck have been talking about the Bossa Nova, bringing together some of the, I guess, more newer approach to things like beyond budgeting, open space, and sociocracy together with Agile in order to bring those together. And we'll talk about some of those on their own right in just a second. So there's a lot of these hybrid methods floating out there, and it's fine to mix and match these things if that makes sense for you. This image makes a lot more sense if you live in Australia. If you haven't seen the movie, it's a movie called Kenny from Australia. He basically cleans toilets. It's a great Australian movie if you're looking for something. This is Scrum Plop. I'll let you figure out why I talked about toilets and that name together. But Scrum Plop is the pattern language of programs. A lot of the basis of what we do in IT is based on patterns. Even the early Agile methods are all about patterns. They've gone away and looked at particularly Scrum and built these as a set of patterns, which you can freely access from the Scrum's patterns database. So if you really want the pattern about how to do a repeatable stand-up or retrospective or what it means to be a cross-functional team, you can kind of see the pattern map there. They've mapped these all out as a set of patterns. There are some newer versions of this. I know that Ivor Jacobson has come up with a thing called Essence more recently. I've been looking to that. It didn't quite make the cut here because I honestly still don't fully understand it. But that's a sort of modern variant of this. This kind of died a little bit over COVID, particularly. They used to have a yearly conference where they would continue contributing to it. I'm assuming it's still on hiatus, but everything in there is still very relevant. Take a look at Scrum Plop. Well, in case you didn't know it, we're doing Agile, but there's an Agile 2. A bunch of folks got together here, a whole pile of authors you can see there, and decided to claim Agile 2 because why not? They came up with a bunch of values and principles. In fact, they have 43 principles behind this. Now, look, I don't know about you. If I was a good geek, I would have made 42 principles and called it the meaning of life. So I think they missed a trick there with 43. Way too many principles in my view. They're fresh look at the meaning of agility, and there's some interesting things in there. A real focus on leadership and broadening it. You can kind of see in their values some of the things they're trying to do, and particularly in their principal categories. Data and team versus organization and leadership. The problem is it's a pile of ideas. There's not really a framework behind it, so you couldn't just implement this and say we're doing Agile 2. As a result, being both new, it's very low adoption, but it's an interesting way of just thinking about how different people are thinking about things, and it's probably one of the newer approaches out there. Quite a number of years ago, Joe Justice came into the community. He did something called WikiSpeed. If you haven't heard about WikiSpeed, this is the car they built. It was an X Prize, trying to build a car that got very low miles to the gallon. This was back in the early 2010s, and in fact, the whole car was built using agile practices. There was a Scrum master. They had weekly iterations. They build the car, get to an end, and they keep building it. Unfortunately, they didn't win the X Prize, but what they did win was a lot of recognition from large manufacturers. In fact, people like Boeing and John Deere, for example, flocked around this idea of extreme manufacturing, which was built on extreme programming. In more recent years, Joe's gone to Tesla and has been applying some of these techniques there in manufacturing. He talks about the fact that everybody has hands on the line. Nobody sits at a desk when they're there. That they do lots of innovations, and it's really a look at agile outside of IT. And some interesting things you can learn both from WikiSpeed and his work at Tesla. Unfortunately, not very well documented. It's mostly videos that they've released and talks that he's done. The thing about this is that Tesla are very open to changing the manufacturing process, which is a lot harder in more established organizations. And what they've found is that the speed of the process has made it hard for the suppliers to catch up. Now, that's not uncommon even in IT, right? You have vendors that are working slower than you, makes it hard to catch up, right? But that's a lot more prevalent when you do this. So they've noticed some of the same problems. Haven't quite licked them all yet, but it's an interesting thing to keep an eye on and see how we're doing things outside of IT. All right, everybody still with me? We're about halfway there. Everyone's still good? Need a toilet break? You got 30 seconds, right? Run. We're going to continue on, right? Because it's a good time to go to the toilet when we talk about scaling. Scaling methods, they're the things that are a little more common these days. So, let's just get out of the way. Let's talk about the granddaddy in SAFe, Scaled Agile Framework, been around since 2007. The work of Dean Leffingwell wrote a book called Scaling Software Agility that had nothing to do with scaling, but did introduce some of the concepts of SAFe. They'd followed up with a book called Agile Software Requirements, which is all about scaling. So got the titles of the books around about, which was really where SAFe got introduced to the world. And then he finally realized that actually this is something he had to share. I've spoken to Dean, before, many years ago, but he basically just said to me, and I think I've got this on the podcast for posterity, this was just a way that they were working in one of his clients that he just wanted to share with the world. And that's where this came from. It's turned into a big beast since then. If you look at the latest digital AI survey, 37% of the world say they're doing some sort of SAFe. You may think that number is low, but when you put that into comparison with the Scrum number we talked about before, right, that pretty much means that Scrum and SAFe, right, sort of rule the roost. And given that Scrum is part of SAFe as well, sort of gives you an idea. There's nothing else anywhere near in scaling the 37%. The thing that popularized this is the big picture, right? You can pick this up. It tells you how to do it. And that's what people are after. So again, they won the marketing war, right? Very easily, right? Perhaps, and I was just reading today, there's just literally today an article or a document's come out. I actually don't have the reference in front of me, where someone's released a document saying, here are all the things that are wrong with SAFe so you can go and tell your leadership about it. It's like a document that you can share around. I'll find the link and share it to you. It literally came up on my Twitter feed, my LinkedIn feed today. Just recently, they did an NPS score of SAFe and it got a minus 56 NPS, right? Saying that people are doing it, but no one's really happy with it. Well, I'm not here to, to throw stones at this. I mean, I'm an SPC. I work in government, so it's kind of one of those natural things. It's a perfectly valid place to start, right? In fact, if you look at it, there's some really good stuff written in here, right? But it's a bit like other things like Prince2 and PMI and PMBOK, is that you just can't follow everything to the letter, right? So a nice place to start, but you probably need to variate at some point. So there's lots of community criticism. It's very heavily RUP influenced because of Dean, and it's very certification heavy. But rightly or wrongly, it is the most popular one. And they have been doing some work, I will give them credit, in trying to bring it more customer centric and some other things. And their core values actually do make sense if you do read them. It's the big picture, I think, that is the bit that comes under most criticism. Well, there are plenty of other options. You can go to Disciplined Agile or DA Flex. More recently was taken over by the PMI, but was started by Scott Ambler back in 2012. I think it's got a little bit sort of messed up a little bit under the latest PMI implementation. They've tried to push the Flex framework of Al Shalloway's in together with it. On its own, it still sort of stands alone. It has always had a better coverage of things like governance, DevOps, and architecture to any of the other methods, and does a reasonably good job of that. Even talking about things like how do you decommission systems that nobody seems to ever talk about. It's always the forgotten bit. So sometimes if you're after some extra detail, even if you're not following disciplined agile, there's often some really good stuff written in here. It is very enterprise IT aware, which again a lot of the other scaling methods aren't. But it's still quite heavyweight and the same as others. It doesn't have a super high adoption record, although the PMI are trying to move that, said that it's still being integrated by them. The other one, which is popular in the scaling place, is LESS. Started really by Craig Larman and Basvotti back in 2008. In fact, back in the 2000s, if you were trying to do scaling, the red and white books there were the only books you ever had, right? That was the only thing I could ever have about scaling. When someone said, hey, how do we get teams of teams working? This is where you went. A couple of years later, they then decided to popularize this around a bit of a framework, but the idea wasn't really a framework. It was just a collection of stories, really. They just had these two diagrams and they sort of said, look, this is kind of what it is. And so they had up to 8 teams, which is less than what I think the stupidly named up to 1,000 people, less huge, which is not less huge, but anyway. A lot of interesting things in here, right? Particularly if you're trying to deal with product owners, right? There's some really interesting stuff in here about how you scale product owners, how you sort of bring management into the process. It's now got some basic rules which it didn't have before, which I think it makes it a little bit more accessible to people, and built on a pile of principles there, which again, very agile in nature. Has a small adoption. It's not huge. I don't see lots of organizations professing to be doing this, but if you're a Scrum shop and looking to scale, it's a very valid option. This is not a method, but I put it here because people make it, right? Spotify is a music streaming company, and they just happen to share their way of working with the world. So when anyone says we're doing the Spotify method, I don't know what they're talking about unless they're a music streaming company. But what is popular about this is Henrik Nyberg, when he was at Spotify in 2012, shared a whole bunch of things about their engineering culture and about their approach, which is why now half the world talks about their teams being squads and tribes and chapters, right? All he was really showing was the matrix process they had inside Spotify, which is all it really is. But what it did is bring a different way of thinking to the world. As they always said, this was just a point in time. Spotify doesn't even operate like this anymore. Yet I still see teams, to this point in 2022 saying, hey, we're going to adopt a Spotify method. It was never a method. It's just a bunch of ideas. Right? And so any of us, right, could share our ideas and put a name on it. And that's okay. It's just sharing of ideas. But I put it here because there is some interesting things to go look at, and you certainly come across it. Particularly a lot of the large consulting companies tend to try to copy this type of approach. Scrum at Scale is another one, particularly for Scrum teams. This is Jeff Sutherland's spin-off of what scaling looks like. This one is super interesting. I don't know how anyone would actually fully implement it, to be honest with you, without a whole massive change of organizational redesign. But I think some of the concepts they have in here are very valid. The term Scrum of Scrums really comes from this, right? It was a term way before this actually came out in 2014, but this has taken that Scrum of Scrums idea and moved on it. In fact, it has a whole pile of different things. Like it's got the Scrum of Scrums. It's also got the Scrum of Scrums. There's also a Scrum of Scrum Masters and Executive Action team, which is called an EAT, and a Scrum of the what they call the Meta Scrum team or the product owners, and they call that an EMT, which to me sounds like something you eat and something you do at an emergency room, but nonetheless, right, they're the acronyms for it. And it's a very interesting cyclical type process, which again a lot of them are missing. They look very just sort of straight, whereas this one does actually reinforce the cyclical nature. Very clear information flow, but as I said, it does require a lot of reorganization. But I think there are things you can pull out of this that you could actually make work inside your organization. That's where I think the real strength of it is. The Nexus framework is the alternative from Ken Schwaber. This was 2015. This one's very simple. It just takes Scrum and says, how do you kind of build the next level on it? It's not a full scaling platform. In fact, if you read the diagram there, it looks like a Scrum diagram, and all he's done is add the word Nexus in front of everything, right? So you have a Nexus sprint planning, a Nexus sprint retrospective, a Nexus sprint review. Really it's just saying, look, if you've got different teams, right, getting members from each of those different teams, whether it be an integration team or a management team, getting them together to talk about things and having a shared backlog is really the essence of it. It has a guide, a Nexus guide that you can also download, very much like a Scrum guide. It's very short and simple to read, but it's not comprehensive. The newer versions of scaling, this is Fast Agile, which I think you might have had a talk on this just recently. Am I right, Ron? I think you had a talk on this the other month. I saw.
We had 2 of them. One recently, about a year and a half ago, we had Ron Cottrell come in.
Yeah.
James Shore recently.
Yeah, James.
Yeah.
Doing an experience report.
Yeah, so yeah, I've seen James's talk, and yeah, Ron Cottrell obviously behind this. If you haven't seen that, go back and look at the videos. I've certainly seen James's talk on this, but built around Cynefin, right? The idea that complexity, and very simple principles and values. One of the things is that it forms teams around the work, right? It only has one meeting as part of it, which is that fast meeting, which sounds really great in principle, but organizations kind of go, what do you mean only one meeting? So again, it takes a lot of different approaches, and it's built around a lot of modern approaches, things like open space. The problem is that our organizations, I don't think, have quite gotten here yet. I think this is an interesting idea. And the interesting thing, and I'm sure James talked about, at least the version I talked about, is some of the struggles he had inside the organization. But this is a way that if you're trying to introduce agility, sort of learning things from these type of methods is very interesting. Open space and self-management and open allocation and all those kind of principles that are built into this are really the core of it. Not a lot of adoption because it's so new. I think the thing that it lacks is actually any type of model or diagram to tell you how to do it. The sort of guidance is very limited, and so that's where someone like James, who's just this incredibly smart person, is able to sort of take it and move on with it. But learning from those things does require a lot of discipline as well. All right, let's talk about technical methods, right? Because let's not forget this was built on technology, even though I think a lot of us as Agilists, sometimes forget that it's more about process, but the technical stuff is important. And so DevOps, DevSecOps, GitOps, and all the other ops that you want to kind of make up all fall in here. I couldn't even fit them all on the slide. DevOps popularized by Patrick Dubois back in 2009. It was just a term he dropped at a conference. More popularized by people like Jez Humble and the like, and the DevOps handbook kind of has that, and Gene Kim and all those sort of folks finally got together and actually put that into a handbook that you can use based on these three principles, right? The end-to-end system, getting the feedback loops in place, and then putting the culture around it. So this isn't a team, this isn't a role. It's a way of working about bringing together the development side of the engine, the operations side of the engine, and of course, when you then bring security into that, which is so important in this day and age, bring the security into that as well. I love these 5 ideals, right? Which are again so very much close related to agility. You can talk about the agility being on the dev side, but really it's just an extension. It's looking right of what we do and saying how do we take agility and get it out to the end. And then of course things like GitOps, for example, exist out there now, which is also taking the same idea but applying it to our tooling. I think both the benefit and the negative of this is no definitive source, right? I think the DevOps handbook is about as close as we get, but again, right, it was just created as an idea, and the people keep building on it. It is, as I said, not a role or a department, but it's about getting better collaboration across the entire organization. Kevin had a programmer, Anarchy. This one's very interesting. It's been renamed to Chaos Development. This was the work of Fred George back in 2010 at a work at an organization in the UK called Forward, where essentially they said, we want to be very agile, so let's just get rid of all the waste. So they got rid of stand-ups, they got rid of stories, they got rid of retrospectives, they got rid of estimates, they got rid of managers, right? They got rid of everything. And they just said, hey, let's just do good work and get into production. And it worked really well. Now, for a lot of organizations, this would be complete anarchy because right, we need those structures around us. But it's an interesting case study in how an organization were able to trim all the things that didn't make sense and just get it back to engineers working as close as they can with the customer and delivering a great product. So there is some papers and conference talks out there. They're very interesting to go look at. I think this idea would work really well in the right culture, but it relies on the culture and the people to make it happen. So I don't think we always have to be locked into the structures we have, but it does require a highly skilled team. The other thing that I do struggle with a little bit is that it's got very little testing or planning built in there, which I think even though if you're terribly good, you still need to have those things backed up, right? They had just an A team of people. Even so, I still think you're going to need things like tests and planning to back that up, even if they're very lightweight. But interesting thing, GitHub and other organizations have also adopted variations of it. One you may not have heard of is the Mikado method. I talked about pick up sticks a little earlier, right? But if any of you are developers or you have developers working for you, and Ron, I'm kind of looking at you here, right? A lot of people like you've got developers that say, I'm going to do some refactoring, right? And I've done it myself. I'm a developer. I'm going to be refactoring. I'm going to do some refactoring. And then 3 weeks later, you're in a hole somewhere. You haven't found where you're going. Refactoring is often just a big excuse for, I have no idea what I'm looking at, so I'm going to go and try and clean up the code. What happened was Ola and Daniel got together and they said, look, there is a process for doing refactoring. So we can actually make sure that we can figure out, what we're doing, set the boundaries around it, and actually make it part of that sort of whole XP spike type process. So it's an approach to dealing with technical debt and refactoring. And so there's a whole language and tooling and things behind this that you can actually use, but it's very simple. It's a bit like the game of pick up sticks, right? The idea is that you only want to move the things that aren't going to bring the whole thing crashing down. And so there's a whole process to this. And so the next time your engineers tell you that they're doing some refactoring, right, actually ask them, is there a bit of an approach they got here, or are they just flailing around? And maybe taking a look at the Mikado method might be something that will help you, particularly if you've got a lot of technical debt where you're doing a lot of refactoring on your tooling. Another one that's been popular in the last few years is mob programming. Pair programming was introduced in extreme programming, and everybody complained that you couldn't do pair programming because it would cost you twice as much. I could tell you I've done pair programming. That's a lot of garbage, right? Well, now in 2012, Woody Zuhl and a bunch of other people came up and they came up with this idea of mob programming. So if you thought pair programming was expensive, this is essentially everybody on your team only using one computer, right? So there's only one place where the code can get into the system. Now, the idea where this came from, if you talk to Woody, he was working at a sprinkler factory somewhere in the middle of nowhere, USA. This organization had a big production issue, and everybody piled into a room for a day or two to sort of solve the problem. And ultimately, they solved the problem. It was a bit of a conundrum or whatever. But when they got to the end of it, one of his folks was walking out of the room. He went, you know what? In the end of it, working together was really fun. Why can't we do this all the time? And Woody went, yeah, why can't we do this all the time? And so that's where mob programming came from, where essentially they said, look, as a team, we're always going to work together. Now, it doesn't mean that people can't do things in parallel. You'll notice that even in this diagram at the top here, if you look closely, people have got laptops out, but the only way you can get code in the system is through one pair and everybody else sort of looking at the screen. So it's supposed to build quality in, it's supposed to, sort of bring things together. You may not think this works, but I tell you, there are lots of organizations that have been trying this and getting a lot of success out of it. And it's actually started to hit the mainstream, even in large organizations. Well worth a look if you haven't seen it before. By the way, if you watch some of Woody's early talks, he'll have you convinced 39 minutes in, he'll be there like, yeah, I'm going to try mob programming. And then the last minute, the first time I ever saw he gave his talk, he said, oh, by the way, don't do this. And he says the reason is that this was just a retrospective item and we look for a way that worked for our team. Same type of idea. It worked for their team. It may not work for everybody. This may actually be something that works for your team and helps them work more productively. So it's well worth a look and adding into consideration. And of course, talking about things like testing, we have TDD, ATD, BDD, SBE, every acronym you can think of. Started by Kent Beck, Test-Driven Development, 1994, a great book that took you step-by-step through test-driven development and formed part of extreme programming. Dan North brought the idea of BDD to us in 2006. Gurko Adzik then extended that to specification by example in 2011. ATD became a term somewhere in the middle there. It's a little hazy as to where that term came from. But essentially TDD, right, making sure that we write tests first at a code level. ATDD, making sure we write tests first at a story level or a feature level. And then BDD is not just the testing part, but it's also the getting everybody together and understanding what it is that we're working on. So specification by example is written by Goiko is really not just about testing, but it's about the entire elaboration and delivery process around collaborating together. So, refining our specifications using examples is a way to talk about them. This is a very popular way for building quality in, providing early collaboration, but it does require teams to be able to get together. And this is often a stumbling block for people doing good agility, is really getting around good elaboration. So if you're still writing lots of big documents and passing over the wall, that was the idea behind specification by example. And the testing community have been, plugging around this for a long time as well. A lot of people think that testing hasn't changed, but the community's been around this since 2001. And if you know anything about testing, the names of James Bark, Kem Kaner, Brian Marek, Brett Petticord are all well-known names in the testing community. Brian was actually at the signing of the manifesto. they've been looking at agile ways of doing testing for a lot of years, and they call this context-driven testing. The idea is that, this is essentially agile testing. They just didn't put the agile name on it because they were working essentially around the same time, but they wanted to make testing more of a human skill rather than a process, right? To say, actually, right, there is a bunch of stuff behind this, and it actually needs a skill set. You just can't shove anybody in to thump away at a keyboard. So it's a school of thought, but it's very much, if you read these principles here, very much aligned to agility. All right, where are we going more recent years, right? Business agility. So business agility is the term, and there's lots of different schools of thoughts here. Evan Laybourne in 2017 formed the Business Agility Institute, and he has his domains of business agility. Essentially, you got to have the leadership, you got to have the people in the organization, and you got to have the operations of the organization working towards the center, which is the customer. The Agile Business Consortium, the DSDM folks who I mentioned before, oops, sorry, go back there. They also have their framework for business agility as well, which again talks about things like governance and strategy and people and bringing all those things together. And Nick Kirsten, has been talking about this for a long time, and released a book a few years ago called Project to Product, and around that introduced this flow framework about thinking about how you get flow from end to end, all different ways of looking at business agility. And in fact, when you look behind the scenes, there's lots of different approaches, and I would have had to have 2,000 methods and 2,000 minutes to get through them all. But if we just use one as an example, beyond budgeting, which is how do you do the whole budgeting and financials process inside an agile organization. What's interesting about here is there's 12 principles behind beyond budgeting. Only one of them have to do with finance. Anyone know what the other 11 are about? You want to take a guess?
They're agile.
No, agile's the outcome. The other 11 are to do with trust and management. Right. So the whole reason we have budgeting is there's a lack of trust, and we want a whole pile of oversight. If you start to eliminate some of those things, that beyond budgeting is all about is saying, hey, we're going to give you some money, you do good things with that money. Right, so things like progressive funding and the like. Right, so in beyond budgeting, only one of them actually has to do with money. The other 11 have to do with management and leadership and those type of things. This, interestingly, did not come from the Agile community. This came from the accounting community, because interestingly, the accountants all go, the whole budgeting process is stupid. They don't like it as much as we do. They're just doing it because they think we want to do it. So when you actually talk to them, there are much better ways of allocating funds and money. So this comes from the accountants. Been very popular in the oil industry in Europe. That's where it's really came from. Where there is a lot of different ways of thinking about funding and prospecting and all those types of things. But this is now how you apply it to organisations, and is becoming a lot more popular across organisations, particularly the small to medium enterprise. Another thing that is outside of the Agile community, but is so crucial to what we do, is design thinking and human-centered design. Again, this has been around since the 1950s. Johnny Arnold, and as part of the Stanford Design School. Richard Buchanan kind of brought the term sort of design thinking to the Stanford Design School, and then David Kelly and Tim Brown really popularized it when they branched out from Stanford into IDEO, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. This whole 5-step process, and the double diamond of diverging and converging around ideas, strategizer and the whole value proposition canvas. I joked the other day that I'd probably need a 40 design thinking methods in 40 minutes talk just to get through this in its own right. Someone that said, hey, that's a great idea, and I kind of wish I hadn't said anything. But there is this is just a whole topic in its own right. What's the real thing here? Customer first. The first principle of the Agile Manifesto, right, talks about the customer. That's why these things fit so well together. Satisfying the customer, as it says in that first principle. There's so much stuff out there on this, but the double diamond and the whole sort of IDEO process is kind of, I guess, the most aligned. One of the problems is that, again, design thinking is so often misunderstood. There's an assumption the process is linear. I've worked with lots of organizations where they get themselves into a hole that they just work through this as a kind of waterfall type process, which it's not. It is a very linear process. So people like Google and their Google design sprints is a much better example of what this is really supposed to look like. But again, this is, again, if we looked at DevOps we talked about the water scrum fall earlier. If DevOps is the scrum fall, this is the water scrum. This is how we bring the design and the development closer together. All right, let's talk very quickly about role methods. because the roles that we have in our organizations are super important. So there are a whole pile of role-based certifications behind here. So the PMI and Prince 2 both have project management type approaches. IIBA has an agile analysis certification, testing from the ISTQB, and even folks like IT Agile have all of the different roles like testing and product owner and developer and DevOps and all of those things under one, as do some of the other certifications as well. So, for roles, there are lots of differences in how roles approach agility. Management as well, right? We could do a whole talk on management. Management 3.0 is probably the popular one from the Agile community ourselves, Jürgen Appello in 2011. The book is interesting, but I actually find the workshop book and the workshop practices probably the more interesting thing out of this type of work, where there's really things to help you do that. Really to put these principles of management, which are, to delight, improve, engage, manage, and co-create. And I think, if we can get management to be more leadership in that type of way, that aligns more to what we're trying to do, and sort of got this little monster down here as the model. There's a lot of different practices available. You can check them out on the website. There's also a book that goes behind it. It does require managers to kind of step out and embrace these types of things. A lot of us as practitioners can kind of help with that. As I said, the techniques are in the workshops. The book is more about the theory, but interesting view nonetheless. Coaching has become a popular term, and facilitation. And so there are lots of models around that. Lisa Adkins and Michael Spade popularized the Agile Competency Framework back in 2011 that said, look, we've got to bring professional coaching to this. So, anyone who's a coach, really, or calls themselves a coach, should be well aware of this competency framework and be building their skills in all areas of that wagon wheel there. More recently, in 2018, the Agile Coaching Growth Wheel has come about, which sort of expands it a little more, and people like Bob Gallen have also sort of got their wheel as well. It's closely related. Things like technical coaching, there's approaches to that. Emily Bash wrote a book last year called Salmon Coaching, which is sort of bringing together some of the key things that you need to do, things like carters and those type of things about how you approach technical coaching. And in facilitation, Liberating Structures from 2013, which is this way of actually having frameworks in facilitation that are very inclusive, and that's particularly important. It's always been important, but is coming more to light. So these liberating structures are ways that you can run workshops and run facilitations that are very inclusive. And then finally, let's just, in our last little section here, let's talk a little bit of some of the organizational methods that are out there. There are lots of methods that come across the organization and government. Back in 2014, Frederick Laloux talked about reinventing organizations and this idea of the teal organization, which honestly, I think for most organizations is just a bit of a, sort of a goal. But certainly getting to green, which is where Agile kind of sits. You'll see here governments, by nature, usually sit in yellow and big organizations sit in red. So it's about not so much ever getting to teal, but moving towards it. Interesting stuff if you haven't read it. In government, we realized there was a gap in government. So myself and a colleague, Julian Smith, no relation, came with this idea of a government agility model, something we've been talking about for the last couple of years, about how we make government more agile. And in fact, a lot of the digital services have been following the lead of the UK government back in 2012 with the GDS and their service standard. The US government has something similar right now, as do governments all over the world. So agility is built in. It's now just changing the culture of those to be more agile, which is what that agility model is all about. Transformation in general, there's a gender shift. This is the work of Mike Burrows. Started in 2015, was recently updated. There was some sort of problem with copyright or something of it, so he kind of almost reworked the whole lot of it, but it's still got the basic thing. This is essentially how you do a transformation. It's a very open transformation framework, and it's kind of this thing down here, which you'll need to expand a little bit, or go check out the website. But it sort of shows you guidance about how to move through the idea of transformation, and it's completely agnostic of any framework. It'll work with any of them. So you can see here, this is just some of the core activities of things like having people included, getting the mapping. They're pretty common sense, but it lays it out in a way that I guess you can kind of follow through. There is a book behind this as well. There are, I think, a few things to it. It is quite general in some natures, so sometimes you're lacking for more information. It also does have an assumption that you actually know what your future state's going to look like, and I can tell you with some transformations, that's sometimes not clear. So if you don't have that, that can be sometimes a little bit of a stumbling block here. Nonetheless, it's full of patterns and strategies, and well worth a look if you're doing a transformation. The other one is open space. This is based on open space technology, which goes all the way back to 1984 in Harrison Owen. And I'm sure many of you have been to a conference and done open space and sat in the circle and came up with your agenda. But now, and we've seen this in a couple of ones previously, things like FAST as well as Bossa Nova, open space is becoming a very crucial element to a lot of these newer approaches. In order to do transformation, open space agility is one of those. That's the work of Daniel Mezek. He came out in 2015. This is where he's saying that you've got 100 days to get to enterprise agility. And he's got this nice little diagram that tells you how it works. And as you just do a whole bunch of open spaces and work through the problems, you'll get there. I don't know about you. I'm very dubious about that in any organization. I think it'd take me 100 days sometimes just to book a meeting room to get people into a meeting, let alone actually get them to do some stuff. But it is interesting nonetheless to take a look at. It talks about these steps. You've got to prepare the leadership, right? You do this whole all-hands meeting. You institute the practices in that 100 days, and then you come back and do inspect and adapt. I haven't seen anybody apart from Daniel who's claimed to actually do this in practice. There's some interesting ideas in here about how we can accelerate. And I think if you look at this as a repeatable process, there's actually some really interesting things in here. So, it's quite simple. It's very aligned, but it does require leadership and it does require a bit of a disruptive nature, but interesting nonetheless. Holacracy and sociocracy. Holacracy, Brian Robinson, 2006. Sociocracy has been around for a long time. This idea of flattening our structure, right? As in Holacracy talks about being more central. Holacracy has this whole constitution that you need to follow, which I'm not sure I really feel like I can sign up. It feels a little anti-agile in some ways. But the interesting thing about both Holacracy and sociocracy is trying to solve some of the problems we have in our organization about the existing structures and the hierarchy. So it does put a lot of more emphasis on the team, right? It does flatten out the management structure and then flattens out the decision making. The fortunate thing about that is sometimes it's not clear where the decision making has happened. It's not sure where the voice of the customer is. So organizations like Zappos are the poster child for this, right? Depending who you talk to, some people think it was awesome. Some people think it was the worst thing they ever did. There's other organizations like Birdsog that are doing these types of things as well. It's an interesting thing to look at. I'm not sure it's the answer to most organizations, but we can learn a bunch of stuff, particularly if you're having problems. So we're taking a look at both holacracy and sociocracy. And of course, we've been in a couple of years of remote. So there's now a remote agility framework. This came out last year, remote AF. The unfortunate thing about this is that it is remote first, but it's pretty hard to get the material about. This is about all you can really get without actually doing the certification. But there are a lot of big names in our Agile community who are taking part in this. So if you're after sort of remote first, remote AF might be something you want to go take a look at. And then finally, the world's full of problems. And so Knefan alluded to that before, right? How do we take systems thinking and how do we sort of, take problems and try and figure out where they go to figure out the best ways of approaching it? This has been continually updated. In fact, I put this model in here and I think I realized I don't even have the latest model. Some of the words have changed in here a little bit, from what they were originally, if you'd seen some of the original wording. I forget which one it is now. I think it might be the novel or something like that's changed in here. But anyway, the wording's changed. Look, if you've ever seen Dave Snowden talk, he's wonderful, but you need to watch him 17 times sometimes to understand him with his thick Welsh accent. There's nuggets of gold in here. It does cost you to access the more in-depth material, unfortunately, and the sense-making software that sits behind it. But as a base tool to be able to look at problems, it's a great tool in our toolkit. Whew, we made it. That's 40. Everyone's still awake? Is this thing on? All right, just a very quick final thought. There is, right, this was essentially there was about 60 something methods in here. There is a lot of things I didn't mention in here. There's a pile of things on the cutting room floor, right? Things like I could have put in things like NVC, nonviolent communication, domain-driven development, lean UX, spiral dynamics, right? A whole pile of new methods are sitting out there. There is like tons of stuff that could have gone in here, but as I said, it would have been 500 agile methods in 500 minutes, right? So if your favorite thing wasn't there, it probably was supposed to be there. It's just that I had to make some tough decisions about the final cuts, and what I was looking for was the ones that we can learn the most from. And so what I want to leave you with is the work of Alistair Coburn. He created this in 2010. It's called the Oath of Non-Allegiance. Unfortunately, it's not online anymore. He redesigned his website and the link's broken. But this is the Oath of Non-Allegiance. And basically what he was asking us all to do is to promise not to exclude from consideration any idea based on its source, but to consider ideas across schools and heritages in order to find the ones that best suit the current situation. In other words, The Agile community is full of awesome stuff, and even the way we used to do things is full of useful stuff. Let's work together to find the best things and bring it back to what we consider to be Agile, which is based on the Agile Manifesto. Folks, that was 40 Agile methods in slightly longer than 40 minutes. Hope you got some value out of that. Thank you.
Nicely done, Craig.
Very well done.
That was really great. Thank you.
Yeah, this was awesome, Craig. Thank you so much.
Any questions?
Maybe we can open it up for conversation. I know that there are a lot of people who have been doing Agile for a while in this call. Do you guys want to share which method you like the most, which method you hate the most? I can tell you, I mean, from myself, I have been a big SAFe guy. I have all the certifications and everything, but from day one, I can tell you, I don't do SAFe as is. SAFe is a good starting point. It helps in terms of discussion up and down the enterprise. It has got a lot of good things, and I customize the hell out of it everywhere I go, and that helps because no company is the same. No BU is the same, even within the company.
Yeah, and I like that, Gopal, because what we do as Agilists, when we go in and do a transformation and we start changing it, well, there's some values and principles beyond the Agile Manifesto that we try to encourage, right? One of them is continuous learning and experimentation. But what I find amongst a lot of Agilists, they don't want to do continuous learning and they don't want to do experimentation. They want to do same old, same old, same old. And it's difficult. But I think if we as Agilists can embrace that, and then when we come to an organization like what Craig, all those ways of doing stuff, if we can find out how they work today. So if I'm a pharmaceutical company, if I'm at a bank, if I'm at a software company, it's different. They work differently, right? So we can apply these different ways. And not only that, they can invent their own way and pick and choose things that work for them and evolve, right? So anyway, that's Jay's opinion.
And I can add to that, Jay, even when we have leadership changes, we have to evolve, even if the team is the same.
Right, because they're going to bring in their way, right?
Yeah.
So,
I'm kind of
Greg,
wondering.
what do you think about that? Do you see more companies kind of creating their own way and picking things and creating their own framework?
Yeah, I mean that's the whole point of this, right? Is that like Gopal said, if you actually talk to any good SAFe practitioner, that's exactly what they'll tell you is that we SAFe is the basis because that was the way we were able to get the change accepted by people. But the reality is that you have to adapt it, and Scrum the same. We talked about the Scrum and so I think the problem is that we have to be very careful as an Agile community that we don't come and pick holes in all of these things just for the sake of it. SAFe is the target right now. In the past, it was Scrum and Kanban. The reality is that we've got to be very careful when we go into an organization that for whatever reason they've made the decisions they've made. It's not about criticizing it, and that's what happens with a lot of and particularly see a lot of the consulting companies come in. They go, just follow this and you'll be fine, and then then we end up sort of picking up all the pieces to clean that mess up afterwards as a community, because it looks good on a PowerPoint doesn't mean it's going to work in reality, because this is about finding the best way of working for the situation at hand. And it's going to be even different within teams, right? What you use in your IT team is not going to work in your finance team. Yet everybody has to have an element of agility, and that's the tough thing about this. And I look at the scaling frameworks particularly as being a beta or a version 1, for want of a better term. We haven't found all the right ways yet I know Joshua Kurioski talks about this in his latest stuff around Joy of Agility, where he's trying to say that, look, we're 20 years into what is probably a 100-year journey here. We're only really just at the start, right? This stuff takes time. So if we realize that.
Right,
Great.
but then you get Josh Kurievsky, who just trashes Scrum, but what he trashes is Scrum done exactly to the book, which nobody does.
Exactly.
I pointed out to Josh the last time I saw him that I do modern Scrum.
Yeah, look, all he's really trying to say is that starting with a bunch of rules isn't always necessarily the best way to do it. And it's a bit like playing Monopoly, right? Is that we all know the rules of Monopoly, yet we all collect all the cash when we hit on free parking or something like that, right? So what are our particular rules of the game? What works for us as the approach? So all of these things can be starting points. Sometimes you might want to be a little more structured when you start out, but the reality is you've got to adapt to what works for the team, not try and force. It's not trying to force a square peg into a round hole.
Yeah, I think that's where I know, Craig, we mentioned it during the class when you taught a couple of weeks ago, but we've adopted the Marty Kagan's the product model for our digital organization. But underlying some of the constructs of SAFe, like you mentioned, is a map, like a how to for organizations just embracing Agile. And I think that's where we're struggling a little bit. Is that it's not as prescriptive to the elements of delivery and things like that SAFe kind of provides. So there's some struggles within our organization right now, just on just we're making up portfolio, we're making up some of the work of the delivery managers, and how do you train some of these people? We have to create our own material and things like that. So just some struggles we're experiencing in large organization with digital.
And that's the struggle we always experience, right? And I noticed, Craig, that you didn't mention Marty Kagan and the product group and the PDMA.
Cutting your own floor, yes.
Yeah. So this is a struggle we always have. So every time, not every time, but most of the time when I go in a company and organization, they want to know the recipe.
Mm-hmm.
Jay, tell me what I got to do to get there, right? Step by step. I want a recipe and a formula that I can follow. And I said, okay, well, here's one, right? But you've got to adjust it. You got to use your brain and rationalize and put it in context and think about how you can adapt it for your unique needs. And then there'll be unique needs across your company. If I go to a different business area or different IT organization, they're going to have different needs, and you'll have to adjust it. What I've noticed, and Craig and others, when I say that to people, I can tell by looking at their face and their physical being that they don't like that message. Right? Look, I need to know exactly what to do and how to do it. And if you can't tell me that and I got to go figure it out, then that's a problem. Right? And I'm saying, well, isn't that what you do every day when you run your business? Is that what you actually do?
Yeah.
This is no different. So I don't know. What do y'all think?
I think they all want to be able to say, well, Jay Johnson said.
I think
that's what I know. That's what I say. I just say, just blame Jay. They go, who's Jay? And I go, it doesn't matter.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But I think it's hard. Well, what I hear all the time is we don't have time.
Yeah.
If you give me a recipe and a formula I can follow, I feel more comfortable. I feel like I have more trust. Not that it can't change going forward, but if you tell me we've got to figure out to begin with, to do initial start, then I struggle with that. That's what I hear from a lot of people. I don't know if you have the same experience.
Yeah, I mean, look, and there's a reasonable amount to that when you because they kind of look at you and go, "What do you mean you've got 10 years experience and you can't tell me where to start?" I think that's the problem is that sometimes we almost go too much in the other direction. But it doesn't have to be a framework off the shelf. It just has to be a here's what we're thinking. We're thinking we're going to put 5 teams together over here. We're thinking we're going to do this, right? We're going to start that as a trial to see how it goes, right? So it's about being clear. And I think that's one of the things that I find a lot of, and Stephen might be able to say to this because I talk about this a lot in my Agile coaching courses, is that, we have to practice what we preach, right? What we end up often doing is waterfalling the whole thing, right? That, we say to them, yes, we'll come up with the entire plan and we'll spend 6 months coming up with it and all this kind of stuff. We have to practice what we preach and go, here's a really clear plan for the next horizon, which is going to get us from here to here.
Yeah.
And if you looked at all those transformation frameworks I talked about, all of them have that same clear thing about, what is your next step look like? What that even SAFE's, the little ladder frameworky thing, right? Even that has a process, at least you're supposed to be able to follow, transformation ladder or what it's called. But they still have a process in order to go through. And I think that's what we have to articulate. What it actually looks like. We're saying, look, what exactly? So Joe Bob down here on the floor developer is going to be doing tomorrow. That might be a little less clear because we want to go and talk to him and find out exactly what he does for the company and make sure he's working on the right stuff. So I think it's somewhere in the middle, and that's why I think when we slave to frameworks, we're in the wrong place. But also, agility is not chaos. It's not just turn up and go, right, well, let's just see what happens. You got to have something behind it. And that's why, saying, look, we're going to loosely revolve ourselves around SAFe or Scrum or Kanban or XP or whatever it is a good starting point. And also that does give people confidence because, rightly or wrongly, there's people who've had experience, there's stuff written about it, there's all sorts of things, and they feel a little better about it.
Yeah, so one of the things Dean Leffingwell has done is the scary part is that it's hard to get to the mindset underneath SAFe.
Yeah.
But what he's done is collected a bunch of practices, and when I go look at Scrum practices, there's scarcely a Scrum practice that doesn't have value. The question becomes, how do we need to use that practice in our company in order to get the most value out of it? And how do we apply it on top of a mindset that helps us to be agile, actually agile, not just doing a bunch of practices?
That's the key. That's not just SAFe. That's all of them, right? Because if you actually follow Scrum by the book, you'd probably be very agile. The problem is that nobody can follow it directly by the book. It just doesn't. Life doesn't work like that.
Yeah. I also think it's about
it worked that way for some company.
Yeah.
By the book.
One.
Stephen, you're about to say something.
Oh, no, I was just thinking too that when you're speaking with executives or even the user community about change, we need to speak with them on their terms, right? If we start as coaches throwing a bunch of vocabulary at them, tossing around framework names and the like that they don't understand, we need to realize that we're talking to business people, and we're even developers, software engineers, things like that, meet them where they're at, and to kind of translate some of the terminology into their speak so that they can understand and welcome us in, as opposed to being a little bit standoffish if they're not really the communication thread isn't there.
Yep, absolutely.
So, Craig, we want to be, sensitive to your time. Any other questions or anything you want to ask Craig? So this is recorded. We're going to put it on our YouTube channel, and Craig, you can send us the deck if you want. We'll publish that too with it. But
you'll need the deck. It was going way too fast to get all the information, so I'll send that through.
I know. Yeah, it's great. I love it. And then we'll publish that as well. Any questions anyone has?
Brianna.
Just out of curiosity, have you ever come across like an agile method that just absolutely was dead in the water before it got off the ground and should never be recommended?
Ooh, interesting question. The dead in the water thing's probably hard because it probably wouldn't have made the radar somewhere. Like every organization I've been into has slightly different versions of it, and there's one LinkedIn posts of things that are out there and the like. There is some controversial ones out there on here. I guess the one that comes to mind is the whole Scrum study, Scrum body of knowledge that came out a few years ago. If I walked over to my, in fact, give me a second to let me show you what I'm talking about. Very quick chip to my fake bookshelf. So you've all seen the Scrum guide, right? It's like 19 pages long or something. This came out. This is I don't know if they've got a new version. This is 2013 version. They actually gave this away at the Agile US conference. This is the Scrum body of knowledge from the Scrum study, folks, which is a 322-page version of the Scrum guide. And this was so controversial at that conference that people actually, because it was put in everybody's conference bag, that people actually just went and burnt it. There was people actually, there was actually, I believe there was a burning party at some point. I kept it because I actually went, what a great prop for times like now, when you're trying to show something. The interesting thing about if you go through here is it's not that it's bad, but it's got these really complicated, it's a bit hard to show up the background there, but it's got these complicated diagrams and things in here. This was very popular in India, and it was a low-cost certification, and they're trying to branch out in the US. They still exist, from as far as I know.
Yes.
But this is an example of something that it's not bad, but it takes something that should be very simple and makes it extremely complicated. And I think what they were trying to do was be helpful, but what they were doing was probably being a little more harmful, right? But again, you have to make your own assumptions around this. But that's an example of one that got a lot of heat from the Agile community. Was that one, Scrum study?
Yeah, and they still exist today, and you can get certified.
Yeah.
I have one other question. I don't know if this is controversial, but do you consider waterfall a method as well? In practice, it is, if you do it correctly, sure, or in theory, it is very agile, but we never see it executed well. But would you consider an agile method?
So it depends what you mean when you say waterfall, Browner. Do you mean waterfall as in the essentially the 5 steps that is analysis, design,
development? Yeah.
So look, agile is, because that's not waterfall. That is the software development lifecycle, essentially. And the software development lifecycle hasn't gone away. You have to know the problem you're going to solve. You have to go code it. You have to test it. You have to build it. All agility is doing that process in very quick succession, right? Whereas if you talk about something like the V model, which was very sequential in its, right, build a big requirement set, test that requirement set, do this. Now, does that still make sense in this world? Sure, right? There are places where if you want to take that risk, and that risk is of time, then go do it. But in this world where things have changed, because waterfall was in the original waterfall paper, which W. Royce was 1970. Our computers were the size of our houses, and now we walk around with it in the size of my watch, right? The same thing. So the way that we approach our work had to be very different, because if you're around at that time, right, you had punch cards and all those kind of things that your mechanism getting stuff into the system, you had one shot. Even when I started programming in sort of the late 90s, I could compile once a day, right, on the mainframe that I was working on, which to me was just like, how stupid is this? But now we compile literally on our computer in real time. So the thing is, the technology has moved so greatly that what we considered to be waterfall has gone away. But the interesting thing is, when people try to hold on to waterfall, my question is, what are you trying to hold on to? Because what people actually don't like is they don't like the visibility, they don't like the speed, they don't like they like the fact that they could take 3 months to do what we really could do in a week, but they had time to lay it out, and that's okay if you've got all the time in the world. So doing smaller things and being more transparent has been one of the big change things for people. But if you want to go at speed, there's no other way of doing it. But think about if you're building the Golden Gate Bridge, you're not gonna sort of just literally build that and go, whoops, the thing doesn't line up in the middle, right? You actually say, we're going to spend some more time doing it. But of course, if you've ever watched a documentary about how they make a bridge like the Golden Gate Bridge or any other bridge, it doesn't go seamlessly, right? They have to be agile in their way of adapting to it. So agility is essentially everywhere, and that's why I say that in what that Oath and Allegiance said is, respect things across all skills and heritages. There are some things from Waterfall, if they still make sense, then still do them. Right. What you got to look at is is there value though? And when you start to look at that and go, is there value in doing a big specification document up front? The answer is no, because the specification document even in 1970 was never solid, let alone in 2022. Great question, Brianna.
Along those lines too, I was chatting with Dean Leffingwell one time about a year and a half ago, and he was saying that it's where you encounter your risks. So waterfall tends to encounter the risk at towards the very end, whereas with iterative development we spread that risk across. And that was really profound as far as really answering the question to executives, the very same question.
Which, however, we think that if we document everything up front, that we've encountered the risks. That's the biggest mindset change for most executives.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think also there's a social and cultural change across the globe. So back in the day when I coded, like you said, Greg, I coded with Hollerith cards and everything and the tech that we had at the time. We had to do it that way. Today, you don't. So the kids coming out of college right now, they're not taught waterfall or SDLC, right? They're taught this new iterative software engineering and software development process. If your company's still doing waterfall, guess what? They're not going to work for you. They're going to go somewhere else. You're not going to get the best talent, right? You're not going to be able to retain it. So there's another level here. It's about how the way we're working and the way we're thinking, but it's also keeping up the way we work and the way we're thinking for today and the VUCA environment, right? And if you can't do that, these smart young people know that. And they're going to go work for companies that can do that because they want to work on the latest, coolest thing, right? They want to be proud of what they're working on, what the product that they're developing, right? And the tech that they're using, right? AI and ML and so forth, et cetera. So that's another spin on it. And when we go to recruit people at the company I work for and how we work with universities and colleges, that's a prevalent theme, right? So so when people say to me, Jay, how come we can't use waterfall for this? I'm going like Craig said, well, what do you mean waterfall? You mean waterfall like we did in the 60s and 70s? Why would you want to do that? This is not the 60s and 70s, right? This is a new world, right? And the people, you're not going to get people nowadays that come in, young people, to do that. They're not going to want to do that, right? So that's another aspect to consider.
Along the same lines, Jay, a lot of schools at younger ages are really focusing on the collaboration, which is the piece that I really like out of all of this, collaborate. And the nice thing is that teachers are giving subjects that they can learn themselves and teach themselves. And I think that's even more important than just the technology itself. If we can have that collaboration, have the conversation, then that builds the mindset that we really want to get to. So I like seeing that happening.
I think there are some places, I'm just not sure how to do it any other way, but some of the large efforts like building a hospital, when you've got, from the ground up, the construction, then the systems that go in for physicians. There's just a lot to do, and there's specialized areas, vendors coming in and different things like that. I suppose you could use Kanban maybe, or lean in that regards, but I just don't know where iterative work could happen, for something so large at scale. So that's the only thought I've had as far as keeping waterfall in an organization.
That's a good point taken. So the soapbox I was on was software engineering,
sure,
and developing tech solutions, right? Now, if I look at building bridges, like Greg said, or building buildings and facilities. I work for Eli Lilly. When I look at manufacturing and how we do lean, we produce medicines and so forth. Well, then, you're not going to do a lot of, let's try this and figure out if it fails a lot, right? Or, so maybe project management, I wouldn't say waterfall, because waterfall is more of a software engineering thought, right?
Sure.
But a project management discipline would work better for that. Is that what you're saying, Stephen?
Yeah. Just trying to understand a little bit about where it might be possible to have something a little more rigid around, the waterfall. I understand about the SDLC and everything, but just that way of working. I had to open a medical office building one time, and I tried using Kanban, but still ran into the issue of, hey, we're specialized. We only do the cabling. That's all we do. I only do this part of the system. I laid down the computers. So it's hard to say, oh, let's all as a team focus on one thing and get it done and drive it across. So it's a little bit different in how you think about it, how you kind of work it.
Yeah, the one thing I can say is waterfall is probably something, I think of it as a phased gate process where you have to have sign-offs at many gates. And if you're in a compliance or a government type of environment, that's something that you will have to have. Otherwise, you won't get paid or you'll get, hit with lawsuits. So, there is some element of that phase gate thing that comes into play in many places, depending on external factors.
On the other hand, the Defense Department demanded Agile, 10 years ago?
Yeah.
If you don't do Agile, you don't do work for the Defense Department.
Yeah, but they still have to go through those phase gates, depending on where you're at. And we have regulated industries, banking, pharmaceuticals, healthcare, right? And they're regulated from external regulators here in the United States, right? And I don't know if you have that, Craig, in Australia, and you have to follow certain processes and rules, right? And it adds more complexity or complication to the cycles you got to do. And I don't know if you have that in Australia, Craig, but in the US, we have industries that are heavily regulated.
So we just
everybody does, but it doesn't mean that you can't do regulative work still in a more iterative way. Is it going to be as fast as dropping out a new mobile app for something? No, but I work with a medical organization that actually it was actually New Zealand, that we're about to launch into the US. And they said, all right, FDA, we're going to have to go waterfall now. And I actually said to them, why? Because you've been working Agile in this way. It's not what the FDA is not asking you to work in a waterfall way. The FDA is asking you for lots of documentation. Now, we can argue if that's right or wrong, but I said the beautiful thing is that you already have the products. All you have to do is write the documentation, right? You have all the evidence this works because you're able to do it in an environment that is regulated, but in a different way. Another regular story I had just recently, I was in just before COVID, so I say recently, but 3 years ago, but I was in the Philippines and I was talking to a bunch of executives, and I think it was the CFO stood up, right, because we're doing an Agile for Executive session, and the executive said, you don't understand, Craig, we can't do Agile here. The Philippines government, is so A, corrupt, and B, backwards, that we can't do any Agile here. And I just looked him straight in the eye and I said, have you talked to them? And he looked at me and he looked at me as also if I've dumbfounded him. And the CEO stood up and went, have you? And here's the end of that story, right? Flash forward to the end. They went and talked to the regulator, and the regulator said, oh, yeah, we've been doing Agile for every other organization in this country. It's just you never came and spoke to us. So we gave you all the old paperwork while everybody else got all the new paperwork. And they were astounded that they were able to cut 6 months off all of their stuff. It's just they hadn't gone and talked to them because they said, oh, a big old insurance company works in big old-fashioned way. We'll just do big old-fashioned approach.
Yeah, individuals and interactions over process and tool.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's the thing. We actually just got to, even things like regulations or even the steps inside something like defense, right? What's starting to happen, and we are seeing it it's happened in defense in the US. I've done a little bit of work there for some of the contractors, but we're also starting to see here as we're starting to break down some of those things. It's going to be slow going. It's nowhere near the pace that we would like it to happen, but it is a lot less bureaucratic than it was, and it continues to get less bureaucratic. The problem is it still feels like 150% bureaucratic to all of us because we're all miles ahead of it. It is happening. It's just slower than we think. And we've got to keep championing in that and saying and just showing people there are ways of doing it whilst keeping all the checks and balances that we need in those environments.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah.
All right, everyone. It's 10:45 p.m. my time in Indianapolis, Indiana. So is there any other questions, or otherwise I think we'll close it.
Let's have a round of applause for our speaker.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. It's always, well, I've only seen you do it twice now. So, but I'm saying it's always, that's a tour de force, Craig. Nicely done.
Well, you said,
everybody.
so you're sending out the link, I guess, for the 40. What about the 60? You said that. You said you had a 60. Is that the next session?
They're a better.
That's a pile of paper that's on my desk.
If you notice, there are multiple names in multiple of those 40.
Yeah.
In fact, I'll add one. Mob programming should also be called ensemble programming.
Yeah.
Agreed.
What was interesting there, though, was the reason I actually didn't put that in there was I couldn't find the source for that. Like I always tried to find the source. So it's it's known as, but there were a few like that. And the reason why the product group stuff wasn't in there was I was also trying to stick away from anything that was more organizationally driven. That wasn't actually a more open framework. There are some that are closed off, but that's why I stuck away from some of that stuff, even though it fits in that whole product development space. So there were a few sort of little rules I had for things that whether I include them or not.
Craig, thank you so much for your time. You said 40 minutes. And this is why we allocate 2 hours, because we have these lively discussions. We definitely want you to come and talk to us again about enterprise coaching next year, if you're up to it.
Sounds good. Look forward to it.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody. I'll send you the links and feel free to reach out on LinkedIn, or if you've got any other questions, happy to answer them.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.
Take care.
Cheers all.